So I've realized I think I have kind of an unfair prejudice against essays or books of essays, and I think I'm probably not the only one because I think I noticed a similar prejudice when it comes to short stories, which I used to read mostly when it came to science fiction, mostly short stories and shorter fiction like novellas. And that was common like in the older stuff, but now most of what people read is books, and most people I know who read science fiction generally don't read short stories and novellas, which I think is unfortunate because I think there's a lot of ideas that work best in short form, and especially for science fiction. I once saw someone say that the novella is like the natural length for science fiction, and I do think a lot of the best science fiction is novella form. But if we're getting back to essays, so this was one of David Graeber's last books. Well, I don't know because they keep coming out, but one of his first posthumous books. And in it, he talks about he's publishing it as a book because it can either be a short book or a long essay, and most people hate long essays but love short books. There's another David Graeber book, The Utopia of Rules, I have, which I think it's 4 longer essays, but I've also talked about this book by Graeber before, Revolutions in Reverse, which I actually didn't read until I had it for years, but I only read it earlier this year or late last year, I think, when I was sort of getting into elite theory questions. But I realized, like, I like reading essays, and when I was younger especially, I read a lot of blog posts and magazine articles, which are basically essays just in different places, right? It's still that same sort of short form nonfiction content. And a couple years ago, I got this book because I just kept hearing G.K. Chesterton come up and people mentioned him as someone I might like. And so I looked him up. And the first thing I got was his novel, The Man Who Was Thursday. And I was thinking it was going to be a Father Brown novel because I'd heard of him for that. And it was not. And I was very confused. I don't think it was a good idea to start with that. And I would not recommend most people start with Man Who Was Thursday. But then I found this book. The title was intriguing, right? In Defense of Sanity. And it's a collection, because most of what Chesterton wrote, it seems like, turns out to be essays, and he had a lot of these. And I've pulled a compilation of 2 of his collections, Heretics and Orthodoxy, which Heretics is sort of themed, so it's like a concept album, basically. And Orthodoxy it builds on itself, so it's a proper book, even if each chapter could, to some degree, stand alone. And that's the funny thing, is I actually love it when books, they build on a theme, but each chapter could stand alone. Like, that is always amazing to me. But I'm talking about, like, actually disconnected essays. And in this book, even when they're drawing from books that had more of a theme, because they're collecting what they think are his best, it ends up being disconnected essays, but they're all really good. And this is unusual because it is a best of collection. But they're still, like, I got this book years ago, like probably 2021, because it was intriguing. Amazon was recommending it based on other stuff I was reading. And then I realized it was a collection of essays, and I was like, oh no, I thought it was going to be like sort of a theme. Like, I've talked about some of Tim Flannery's books, and I thought it was going to be like that with one theme. And then I've noticed, like, stuff I read, it keeps referencing this book. So I'm like, I should actually read it, and I haven't yet. And this is the only book I'm going to show you guys that I haven't read yet. But I've been feeling like most of what I've been reading recently has been stuff that is in some way related to the channel, or stuff that I think people would be interested in. I'd like to think I'm not going full audience capture, but I am sort of biased in what I've been reading by, could this be relevant to the channel? And this, books on like animals on evolution talking about that tends to do less well. And so talking about this might give me license or incentive to actually read this now that I'm realizing I actually really like reading essays, and I think it makes sense to do more of it. So I actually, immediately after recording this, I went down and I was going to read the titular essay here, and I realized this is actually, I think, an actual normal book. And I was thinking of this book. So Song of the Dodo is a book on island biogeography in an age of extinctions is the subtitle. Flight of the Iguana is the collection of essays I was thinking of. They're both by this guy, David Quammen, and I think I've seen both of them referenced a lot. But I think Flight of the Iguana is the one that I have seen referenced more. But I'm probably going to read both of them now, because I'm going to read the titular essay at least here. And if I like his writing, and realizing this is actually a coherent book, which is still my tendency to read, probably read it sometime soon. And I read a lot of C.S. Lewis last year, I think it was. And he didn't write a lot of essays, but this book has one, The Lilies That Fester, where basically he's arguing that the people who Musa al-Harbi, never been woke, and basing on Pierre Bourdieu, calls symbolic capitalists. C.S. Lewis uses a different term, I think, but basically he argues that historically art was made for the consumer, or for the patron, right, who is still sort of the consumer. And now we have this inverse idea that the consumer of art exists for the artist. And so it ends up being, for these managerial positions, which again, Lewis isn't referencing by that term, that as sort of a gatekeeping, as a signifying what Bourdieu would call symbolic, would call cultural capital, that you know that you belong there. You have to know and have to pretend to appreciate a lot of modern art, which is made to indulge the artist rather than to appease the audience, which is, I think he's pretty correct, and I've referenced it in a few of my blog posts. Most of these others, few of them were okay, but that was the really memorable one. He hasn't read a lot of essays, but I bring up Lewis and Chesterton together a lot. I also bring them up with Idries Shah, who he wrote a lot of short-form content, but I don't know if you could call it essays. He tended to either write like full books or like collections of like really short vignettes and observations that don't rise to even the length of essay. And so I'm not talking about that. I think that, and also like blog posts I'm going to treat as a different thing. And then I started reading Burnham's Managerial Revolution, which I mentioned. I read Samuel Francis Leviathan building on it, but I haven't read that. And the introduction referenced an essay by Orwell that seemed really insightful in terms of how Burnham thinks. And it's interesting because I didn't realize the Managerial Revolution, Burnham was actually praising the Managerial Revolution at the time. So that's interesting. And he actually has another essay on Burnham in here and a few other things. And so after reading that, I was like, I have Orwell's essays. I want to read more. And I've been reading them. And Orwell, like I read 1984 high school, I think, Animal Farm, high school or middle school. I hated Animal Farm because I didn't know enough about Soviet stuff. I didn't realize it was a parable about that, and I read it as just a standard work of fiction, which was not enjoyable. But I like 1984, which is the one that everyone references often without reading it. And I hadn't read his essays, but he was actually a really perspicacious, like insightful, like he was good at observing human nature and drawing out interesting insights. And the only essay in here that I had heard of by name before my father told me about was Shooting an Elephant, which is he's in Burma, and there is a domesticated elephant that goes on a rampage. And so he has to kill that, and he's sort of thinking about the implications of colonialism in this context, which is interesting, and I won't spoil it. He also, he talks about Kipling, and he and Chesterton have both criticized Kipling from sort of similar but different angles, and his criticism of Kipling is Kipling, he worships imperialism, right? But he also, the reason he sort of outlasts his critics is because he actually has a sense of responsibility. I think Orwell even said something like Kipling was the only real conservative left in Britain. Like his understanding of that was someone who sort of worshipped power for power's sake, but he also understood the responsibilities, the obligations of power in a way that people don't do. And so there's a number of insights on this. Another one that he wrote, which was one of the longer ones, was defending the importance of free speech even for ideas we don't like, which I've been debating several things for my 4th of July video for the 2.5 centuries, whatever the term for that is, 250 years. And one of the things I've been considering is on the subject of free speech, which Americans, as you probably know, have a much stronger conception of that than anywhere in the world. And I think Orwell did a good defense of that. So there's a bunch of interesting things in here, and I've read only a small fraction of this. And then people had been telling me to read Slavoj Žižek, and I meant to look up, and Slavoj Žižek would be my guess is how it's pronounced, but I haven't actually looked up how it's pronounced. But anyway, I read his book on Lacan, which convinced me to read more of him. And then I noticed he had a collection of these essays that were like $10 each and have names like Against Progress in Liberal Fascisms and How Can You Resist That? And so I've fully read this one, and they're varying degrees of interesting, but they're enjoyable to read. I'll have to think about if any of these essays actually have anything that I want to talk about here, and I haven't read this one or the one in between with a less interesting title, just 0 Point, yet. And then at this point, so after Žižek, I was sort of realizing, I like essays, and I haven't been reading them. And in fact, there have been people who I've been aware of as writers, and I either haven't bought their stuff or I bought it, but I hadn't read it because they were primarily essayists, and I was sort of prejudiced against essays. And so started reading some of them. Or actually, before I do that, right, I pulled Borges' Selected Nonfictions, which I read 2 years ago after Taleb's Anti-Fragile, after discovering that. And I liked his fiction, but reading his nonfiction was when I realized I really relate to him, especially his stuff on the craft of writing. And he's also a good poet. I've read his poetry too, but this is about essays. But anyways, so going back, so after Žižek, and I read this cover to cover, I was like, if I have these books, I should read them. And if I don't, I should think about getting them for some of these people I know about, but either haven't read or haven't got their books because they're mainly essayists. And so one of them is E.M. Chorin. I think he's Romanian. And this is not the one I've been reading, but I could not find the one. I think it was Anathemas and Admirations is the one I was reading, and that's going to be one of those things where I like put a larger book and it's a thin book right on top of it, and so when I reorganize my books, I'll find it. But I was reading it. I read several of those, and one of them. So he was talking about Borges too. So this is actually a good segue, and he was saying in that book, Anathemas and Admirations, that Borges was incredibly unfortunate because he was someone who deserved to remain obscure his whole life. And yet he ended up becoming famous, and that kind of ruined him, which, I mean, I don't agree. I think it's good for Borges and good for me discovering Borges. I mean, I still might have, even if he'd remained obscure, found him, but certainly I still might, like, I've been going down a lot of rabbit holes and finding obscure people, but it definitely helped to discover him, that he was kind of famous. And so when Taleb mentioned, I'm like, oh yeah, I've heard about him. I should actually look into him, and discovered I liked him. And then two others who I've heard about a lot and wrote a lot of essays are Wendell Berry and Walter Benjamin. And Walter Benjamin was a literary critic who has had a lot of impact on Frankfurt School, for example, but on a lot of people. And I think Zizek actually mentioned him a few times. And I've read 3 or 4 of these essays. Read the one on Bertolt Brecht, at least one of the ones on Kafka. And then there were a couple he wrote on book collecting and translation that were... So the book collecting one was basically, I feel, almost atmospheric. The translation one, that's one I think I have to dwell on more and think about what he meant. And then Brecht is, again, he's saying something that I think is important, but I need to digest and process it. I literally just read these essays a day or two ago. Again, he had been like someone I was aware of, but since he mostly wrote essays, I just never got around to reading him. And then Wendell Berry, again, is someone who I've seen multiple references. I think in my environmental science class in high school, we read one of his essays as a response, as a counterpoint to The Tragedy of the Commons by Garrett Hardin. And then I mentioned in a previous video, I had Patrick Deneen's book, Why Liberalism Failed, and he is a big fan of Wendell Berry, which was kind of surprising to me because my understanding of Wendell Berry was not someone who would be really compatible with Deneen's Catholic integralism, but he was a critic of a lot of features of modernity, and I'm thinking I might actually do a couple of shorts reading 2 of his shortest essays, because I think I could read them in the time to put them in shorts, and they're really compelling and reason to read this. And so the 2 shortest essays in this book is the titular one, What Are People For? And then the one that comes after that, which is Waste. And they're both 3 pages long, so you might see shorts, you might see me. We'll see. But anyways, I just wanted to talk about this because I feel like certainly I have tended to underrate the value of essays. And I think part of it is if a book is good and compelling, it's often going to be strong all the way through, right? Whereas books of essays can often be variable in terms of how strong they are, or if a book is thematically interesting, it'll probably be thematically interesting to you all the way through, or it's more likely. Whereas essays are more likely to be on topics, oh, I'm not interested in this one. I mean, exceptional writer can make pretty much anything interesting, but mediocre writer, or even a good writer, it depends more on whether you're interested in it. But still, I wanted to talk about this, and if you don't read essays, I encourage you to read more essays, and here's, I guess, some as a starting point, and I'm trying to put Amazon affiliate links in the description. So thanks for watching. I'm Magpie, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Slavoj Žižek, apparently. So I was close.